In Philippians 2:17, Paul states that even if he is being poured out like a drink offering onto their sacrifice and service of their faith, that he would still rejoice. This concept of drink offering would have been very familiar to both Jewish and Gentile believers that made up the church in Philippi. Often, wine was poured over a ram or a lamb before it was offered as a burnt offering, so that it would create this sweet smell that would be pleasing to God. So what Paul is saying is that as his life is being poured out, that is a sweet smell to God. The other reference is that the church in Philippi would have came together to celebrate communion. They would broke the bread and also drank the wine and thought about how Jesus emptied himself in order to give them all that they have. So this idea of pouring your life out, sometimes we think that if we pour our lives out to the service of Christ and others, that somehow we'll wind up with an empty bucket. But let me tell you something, when we pour our lives out just like this, what a sweet smell this is to God. And not only that, but would you rather have an empty bucket of water or all of this? There's so much more to it. What God is really calling us to is to pour out our lives, not just bits and pieces, but the whole thing, and that we will have fullness in it. Romans 12:2 tells us that we can pour out, we are supposed to be living sacrifices that are holy and acceptable to God, that we really can pour out our lives to God. But the thing is, Paul also tells us that we should do it without grumbling and complaining. And sometimes that's kind of hard because God asks us to do some really hard things. But you know what? Let's move inside and talk about that a little more, because let me tell you, it is hot out here. Romans 12:1 tells us that we are to be living sacrifices that are holy and acceptable to God, which will be our spiritual worship. There really is joy in pouring yourself out into the service of Christ and others. And, first, before we really get started here, we need to define service, because I think for years what I thought service was for Christ was just a service project that you did a couple times a year, that you would check off your box, and it's really much, much, much more than that. It's your life, everything in your life. It's not to separate both church life and your regular life. It's offering everything up that you do. The way you live your life, the way you treat people, the way you speak to people is all part of what you offer up. And we do everything as though it is for the Lord, to the Lord, and yet also flowing from the Lord. It is a beautiful thing. So when you think about it, no matter what you do, whether you work outside the home, maybe you're a nurse or a teacher, maybe a salesman or a businessman, maybe you're a stay-at-home mom or you run a daycare, whatever it would be that you would do it as if you're doing it for the Lord, to the Lord, and yet it's coming from Him, from the Spirit within Him. It is such a beautiful thing, and it brings a lot more purpose and meaning to our lives when we live our lives in service to Christ and others. Jesus really wants to be the Lord of our lives, and that means He wants to be the Lord of our minds, our mouth, our heart, and our actions. And our service to God, it includes some really hard things, like loving our enemies and blessing those who curse us. Those are tough things to do, and yet Paul tells us to do it without grumbling and complaining. That grumbling and complaining in Philippians is also interpreted as murmuring or even arguing. So you'd be arguing with the truth that's within you. You'd be arguing with the very Spirit that was within you. That grumbling and complaining is very offensive to God. It shows a lack of faith and a lot of times a prideful heart, especially when we're critical of others, just like we learned in our homework last week. This grumbling and complaining, we have a great example of grumbling and complaining way back in Exodus. And you probably remember the story of the Israelites, how God saved them from Egypt, brought them into, parted the Red Sea, brought them into the wilderness, fed them manna on the ground every morning so that they have just enough. Their shoes and their clothes didn't even wear out. God had a pillar of fire at night to keep them warm and for them to follow. He had a cloud by day to keep them from the hot sun. He had water coming out of a rock for them. Miraculous things were all around them, and yet all they could do was grumble and complain about it. They wanted to go back to Egypt because they wanted to eat meat. And God found it offensive to keep grumbling and complaining. They even complained about Moses and Aaron. And eventually, they did feel the consequences of their grumbling and complaining. Number one, they spent 40 years in the wilderness, a lot longer than they needed to. And I wonder sometimes if some of our grumbling and complaining keeps us in some of the really yucky stuff that we don't want to be walking in. Our grumbling and complaining really will zap our joy. It will zap our joy, and it will also zap the joy of the people around us. One of the ways to take care of grumbling and complaining and to really have that thankfulness that really the Israelites could have had. They could have had so much gratitude to God for all that God had done for them. But instead, they just grumbled and complained. But if they had stopped to think about it for a little while, they could have said, thank you for the manna on the ground. Thank you for the water. Thank you for the cloud that keeps us from the sun. They could have thanked God for all of those things. And number one, their joy would have increased, and their grumbling and complaining would have decreased. One of the ways that I came up with to try and deal with some of my own grumbling and complaining, and sometimes just seeing the negative in whatever situation that I was in, is I started what was called a thankful jar or a blessing jar, just like this one here. And what I did is I took a calendar, just a rip-off calendar, and I didn't get super legalistic about it. If I missed a few days, I missed a few days. But when I remembered, I would pull it off, and I would write one thing that I could be thankful for on the back of it. I'd put them all in the jar, and then on January 1st of the next year, I would open them all up and read them. And it's always so fun to see what happened on that day. And I'm going to be honest with you, there was times when I kind of grumbled before I even wrote my thankful thing. This one in particular says that my husband Dave stayed up until 2:30 listening to the sermon that I was going to do for Lent that year. And I just said I'm so thankful for him. I will be honest with you, 99.9% of the things that I was thankful for were the people and the people that God brought into my life at just the right time that I needed them. The other 0.1% is probably a cup of coffee and a hot bath and maybe some fuzzy slippers. But you know what? We always have something to be thankful for, and it changes our perspective. Whatever you're going through right now, and I know there's a lot of people going through some really hard things, find a way to see the small little graces that God is bringing into your life every single day. Just find ways to be thankful, because it will make all the difference in your service to the Lord. I hope you guys get into the homework. We're going to talk a little bit more about the people, the Israelites in the Exodus. And we'll learn a little bit more about service to God and also about grumbling and complaining and thankfulness. Have a great week.